the key mistakes that I did when I was still working in banks as well is that trying to wow my audience too much with the method, and then with the modeling, and then say, look at what I've done. And then when everybody says, okay, nice, good, yes, you're smart, but like, how can we apply that, and how can we grow our business with that? And that context is missing a lot. And then this is also, I see this when I'm looking at all these discussions on machine learning. It's like, okay, yeah, good, you're smart, but how can we, grow the business with that? How can we grow brands with that? And it's just too much focus on unearthing things that may not be important in the big picture.
Hey, what's going on?
Yeah, pretty good. Things are pretty good. It's late here in Adelaide.
It's the afternoon here. I hope you're not too tired.
No, it's all good. What's
Wonderful.
the weather like in the Netherlands?
Hot, very hot. It's we have a very finicky climate, and it's one of those summers where you have like 3 scorching hot days, and then you don't see the sun for another 363 days or 62.
Yeah.
So yeah, you're in Australia, right?
Yeah. So I'm in Adelaide, in South Australia,
Wonderful,
where the institute is.
Wonderful. By the way, quick question: how do I pronounce your last name?
Tanusondjaja. If you say it as that's perfect.
All
like
right.
Dutch version.
Wonderful. All right. So for the people who are listening to this, I'm here with Dr. Tanusondjaja. Hopefully I said that correctly.
Yeah.
Lovely. All right. Most of the people in the marketing science community will already know this wonderful human being. He works at the EBI, Ehrenberg-Bass Institute, Marketing Science Institute. A lot of marketing research comes from there. So I was wondering if you could give us a quick little intro on your background.
Sure. So I've always been quite a nerd. So my first degree was actually in computer science many years ago. I'm originally from Indonesia.
I saw that on ResearchGate, and also applied economics, if I remember correctly, right?
Yes, that's right. So
talk about understanding the whole landscape.
Yeah, well, I've always talked to other folks and then said, like, if I want to complete the whole picture, it would probably, the last missing piece would be psychology. But I don't think I have.
I knew you were going to say that. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think I have enough stamina to sort of like go to another degree. So yeah, but that's it.
Yeah.
So basically, I my initial career is in banking and finance. I work in several multinational banks, but then I decided to move back to Adelaide, where I studied my undergrad, and then work in a local bank here, and then joined the institute in 2010 it was. So yeah, I've been with the Ehrenberg-Bass Institute since 2010.
Interesting. How was that shift from something like computer science, where arguably the environment might be a lot less murky? So when we're talking about marketing, sometimes things can be a little bit context dependent, whereas in computer science, it tends to be more on the physics end of the spectrum.
It's interesting you say that, RJ, because I think this is one of the weakness of all this focus on machine learning and all this focus on, say, data analytics, right? Without context, everything is lost in the data. Because like, I think some of the mistakes that I did when I was doing sort of like, looking at data from data's sake, being a nerd, it's just like, oh, look at this, look at that, look at this pattern, look at this correlations and this and that. Without context, I think everything comes to the surface, and without real understanding, everything is made interesting. And then one of the key mistakes that I did when I was still working in banks as well is that trying to wow my audience too much with the method, and then with the modeling, and then say, look at what I've done. And then when everybody says, okay, nice, good, yes, you're smart, but like, how can we apply that, and how can we grow our business with that? And that context is missing a lot. And then this is also, I see this when I'm looking at all these discussions on machine learning. It's like, okay, yeah, good, you're smart, but how can we, grow the business with that? How can we grow brands with that? And it's just too much focus on unearthing things that may not be important in the big picture, if that makes sense.
That makes perfect sense. It's very interesting that you say that. Yesterday, or the day before yesterday, I was invited to give a keynote at Meta, formerly known as Facebook, Prince, the artist formerly known as Prince.
Yes,
and
yes.
And the theme this year was insight. And one of my slides actually had something very similar to what you're saying on it. Data doesn't equal insight, because sometimes there's this lazy approach where the underlying axiom seems to be, if we can only gather sufficient amounts of data, vast quantities of data, then we finally don't have to think anymore. We can outsource the thinking to the data, and just collect more data. And it's like, well, the insight still has to come from you. And I feel like creatives, people who are actually executing the ideas that the marketing team comes up with, they understand this well, because they understand that simply having the right pinpointed the right strategy is not sufficient. The marketing team says, okay, this is the insight, this is what we want to do. The creative team can say, okay, cool, let's copy paste that and show it to the consumer. No, you have to find a clever way. We want to communicate that even though we're the market challenger, we're still, a very good choice, even arguably more superior than number one. You can't simply say that, we're awesome, even though we're number two. No, you have to find a clever way. And then suddenly you have Avis, we're number two, so we try harder. We can have dirty ashtrays because we're number two. So or we can't afford not to be nice and not to treat you well because we're number two. So that's a very clever way of thinking about communication. Everyone who's married or in a relationship, whatever, knows that the tone the tone of the message, not just the content of the message. So data is necessary, but it's not sufficient in and of itself.
Totally, totally. Because I think, I know about machine learning from my years in computer science as well. And then so when everything is just like all this artificial intelligence, for example, now everybody seems to want to include that in the talk or in the strategy, and this is one of the key criticisms of when somebody talks to the Ehrenberg-Bass Institute and looks at our approach, and they said, but that's just too simplistic. And it's just some of the criticisms of the things that we do. But I think now, having done the complex thing, and then having done sort of like the approach that we do at the Ehrenberg-Bass Institute, and I see the beauty of doing things in a clear, transparent way, so that you can apply intelligence on it, and then just do and apply that on the business strategies, rather than being bamboozled by the technique and by the modeling. And at the end, yes, it looks smart, but it's not applicable to the business. All these discussions on artificial intelligence is just like, yes, it is good, but how can we really do it in a big scale, and does that really affect brand growth or business growth or not?
It's obviously I wanted to talk to you because I saw your material, and I was already like, I like this guy. So we're gonna find a lot of agreement, and there's no disagreement here. I work with a lot of bootstrappers. Actually, on occasion I do consulting for like bigger firms, etc. But my main bread and butter is people who are like just starting out, finding their first customers, all of that stuff. And in that particular specialism, one of the things that you see is kind of two sides of the spectrum. So on the one hand, you have the people who I call like mouth breathers. And there's actually a term in the literature, in the philosophy literature, which is a bullshitter. And a bullshitter is yeah, it's someone actually classified that a bullshitter is someone who doesn't care about the truth value of a statement, only about the means to an end. So they're trying to achieve an objective. So usually it's like increasing their audience size or getting customers or whatever, and they are willing to say whatever it takes in order to achieve that. And a lot of the marketing books, for the commercial marketing books, in my opinion, are written by mouth breathers, because they are only thinking about sales and all of that stuff, and they couldn't care less about actually helping you. They don't care about helping you or harming you. It's all about like, does this what I'm saying actually move the needle? And the problem with that is that oftentimes bullshitting, so not lying but bullshitting, is more effective because of things like confirmation bias. So if you already believe something is true in marketing, and I restate it, and it's like then you get the validation that what you believe is already correct. There's a lot of psychological research on confirmation bias in terms of like your political views, etc. Same is true in marketing, because it's also very tribal in a sense. And the other end, the other end of the spectrum, which I see a lot of, unfortunately, is a little bit in my own community, where the people are more evidence-based. And I call these people, I stole this term from a blogger called Scott Young, complexophiles. So these are the well, actually people. So what they are saying is technically correct, but they're only adding confusion instead of clarity. Yes. So the analogy that I use is you have a high school kid, or maybe first year university sophomore, who just learned calculus, and he's explaining something about calculus, and then you get some smart ass, who just wrapped up his real analysis, and he's like, well, actually, this is a very generalized situation of the real analysis. It's like, dude, come on. What he's saying is true. You're just pointing out technicalities, and you're not doing it to help anyone, but you just want to boost your own ego and show everyone how incredibly smart you are. But the problem is that only serves to further confuse the hell out of everyone, and it's super annoying, because marketing is already hard enough.
Yes. Yeah, I would agree with that as well. And I think, the challenge is, I think it just convincing. I think this is the thing. I think when in the past, sort of marketing is so convoluted with a lot of beliefs and a lot of principles, right? They're basically based on opinions and hearsay. And I think when we are trying to sort of like put science into it, and I think, of course, then there would be a pushback from people saying like, oh, you're taking the creativity, you're taking the joy out of marketing. But on the other hand, I think it's actually
let's do architecture without physics then.
Exactly. And then
or medicine without an understanding of the human body.
Exactly. And then like one of my favorite things, like when I spent some time in London in 2017, and that was unfortunately it was after Zaha Hadid passed away, and then she was a really fantastic architect, and like doing all this wonderful creative ways with the material and making buildings. They're basically curves and bows. And then like, if you don't have any good understanding of how the tensiles, the materials, and physical, physics principles, like you can't make those beautiful buildings. And the same with marketing. I think this is like, if you're doing weird things without knowing how consumers behave and how memory works and how brands grow, I think you're just basically as good as any snake oil seller is. You have to sort of like know about the principles.
Yeah. Again, probably a theme of this podcast. Very little disagreement there. This is actually a perfect segue, because this is the main thing that I'm hoping to extract out of that head of yours, which is filled with marketing science goodness. I'm going to try. I'm going to try and download as much as possible.
Golly.
So one of the things that I'm I want to know, and I think the audience, the listeners, will be interested in this as well, is how should we go about doing that? There are a lot of people who talk about marketing. You know, there are books from people like Seth Godin, who no offense, but sometimes they're kind of like astrology, where it's not true or false, but because it's so vague, you know, it doesn't. You can always find a way to claim that what you're saying is actually true. Simon Sinek with his essentially brand purpose, just worded differently, all of that stuff. So if you're lacking if you don't have the necessary expertise, like you, for example, then you're not able to recognize whether or not something that you're reading is true or false. If the argument is convincing enough, because we're not doing mathematics, you can't like verify the proof or something. So that puts you in a very tough position, because the only people who are capable of discerning whether or not this is nonsense are the people who already have that information, so they don't need it in the first place. So what should people do who are trying to become better at evidence-based marketing? Is there an approach or a process that you can recommend, or are there certain books or authors that you can recommend? Obviously, for anyone listening, you know, the Byron Sharp, or How Brands Grow, and the Distinctive Asset book series, etc.
Yes,
read those as a starting point.
Exactly right. I think the How Brands Grow, the first one and the second one are really, really good, great starting point in terms of basically connecting, the principles of evidence-based marketing as well as the results. And there are some great books coming from the Institute as well as outside of the Institute. But I would say, look, I think beneath all of this is, I think, the need for marketers to know basically how their work affects the business operations and business results, right? Because I think in the past, it would be marketers live in their own world, like being given tasks to perhaps design the latest advertising or customer communications, et cetera, and yet don't have real understanding of how those activities actually grow the business or not. And I think this is where it's lost. And then when you present to the CEO, the C-suite, and then we have, the marketers would have their own language, and have no way whatsoever on how it affects the bottom line, or how to argue intelligently that looking through ROI, for example, in everything is just dangerous. And then basically having that sense of connection that actually marketing is really, really important for business growth. And then a set of language, a set of sort of like terms that the CEO would understand, like, yes, focusing on sort of like penetration is really, really important. And, and knowing how these principles can actually grow the business in the language that would be understood by the C-suite is actually really important as well. So I think it's that understanding. Basically, marketers should not live in our little creative bubble, that we should get out and basically learn how to speak with the finance team, with sort of like the sales team, with the C-suite as well. That is actually really, really sort of, our job and our role is really important. And I think this is related to the latest cartoon from the Marketoonists, right? So, and then like there's the latest edition that came out yesterday was like, chief marketing officer. It seems to be like almost like a taboo word, a taboo phrase. Now it's like changed to the chief growth officer or chief whatever officer. It's like, come on, marketing is actually pretty cool, like we have a really important role in to grow the business. We should own it, but it's basically own it intelligently. Like it's actually, putting science into the growth of the business. Our role is actually really crucial.
Do you have any tips to avoid mistakes? Essentially, say you're doing physics and you have a hypothesis and you think something is right. You go through the literature, you talk to a few experts, you try and figure out, what is true, what isn't. When we're talking about marketing, sometimes because these effects can be so subtle, that can be a little bit harder, or maybe they're true in a certain domain, but not another domain, certain kinds of businesses. Do you have any advice there? Because like you said earlier, you want to avoid this situation where it's like my opinion versus your opinion.
Yes. And I think, look, one of the things, I guess from an early age, I've always been a thinker. So I'll try to sort of like, I like to think an analogy. And then so I think, and then from when I built my career in banking as well, the old approach of champion and challenger that was popularized by GE, General Electric at the time. And I think, I was introduced to that concept from an early age. So, and I think, test something and see whether it works or not, and then learn from the mistake and make hypothesis, and not just for the sake of testing, say, creative or approach or products, but like test it and see. And then if it fails, learn from it, and then just don't make the same mistake the next time around. And also basically just think widely. And I think this is why I studied computer science and applied economics and marketing. I don't want to sound wanky either. It's sort of like,
No, it's fine.
I've studied this, but I think there was a book that I read a while ago. I think by David Epstein. I probably have read it, like Range. Yeah, that's right. So I mean, like, I think talking about looking at analogy and then looking at like how the natural world works, and then see perhaps some of the principles actually translate into business. I think, we need to learn about to be lateral thinkers, basically. Yeah. And then and see whether there are things that we could learn and then we can apply. And that's why I think marketing science also grows from the practices that we learn when we adapt from natural science as well. That there are some law-like principles that govern how people behave and how people sort of like purchase our goods and grab our services as well.
Yeah. I'm wondering, I have an opinion. I'm curious to see if you agree or or disagree.
Sure.
When I went to a university, I was originally trained as a pure mathematician, essentially. Eventually, I dropped out to run my first company, and I never went back, but I continue studying mathematics every single day. It's just a part of my day, so I'm still doing it. But the educations on mathematics is it's quite decent, and one of the benefits when it comes to mathematics is there is such a thing as right or wrong, and there's there are no opinions. No one is interested in your opinion. People are interested in your proof.
Yes.
So
yes.
that makes it very easy. Say you want to learn, say again, to use calculus as an example, you just go to YouTube or buy one of the trillion books on calculus. And you can just learn it very easily. But with marketing, there you can pretty much find it resembles astrology much more than astronomy. So that's something that's very annoying when you're trying to become an evidence-based marketer and have a better understanding of what is actually true and what is actually false. So my opinion is that the marketing education is quite poor because of this issue. I'm wondering if you agree with that or disagree with that.
I agree with that, and I think to a certain degree, perhaps this isolation during COVID as well has made people turn into some really weird philosophies. And I think all what is happening now in the world is, even we can have multiple versions of the truth. But I think if it's almost at the end, it's almost like it's good. Well, you can have belief, but there's some in terms of sort of like, say, business principles or natural principles. It's good to sort of like come to everything with open-minded, but also to have a little sense of skepticism. And basically, even one of the things that I used to do when I hear great speakers going to conferences, I would go googly-eyed, like, would absorb everything that they say
Yeah.
without questioning. And now I'm more questioning, like, okay, that sounds interesting, but hang on a minute, how can I translate that in my day-to-day business? So like, how can I apply it? So, and I think it's true. I agree with what you said. Like within marketing, it's still a lot of astrology and not rather than astronomy.
And also the dissemination of knowledge from the people who actually do know. So that's one of the reasons why I'm trying to have people like you on, and people who really know their stuff, because I think that knowledge is there in certain, but it's just a little bit siloed, because many professors in marketing, they know what they're talking about, but ironically they don't have like huge platforms. And one of the reasons for that, I think, is that confirmation bias issue. You're going to be much more popular if you tell people what they want to hear. So one of the things that people want to hear. Yeah. So you have this perverse incentive to do the very thing that that you don't want to do in this situation. And it's I can imagine that probably with medicine, I wonder if they went through a similar situation where people wanted to get reaffirmed that their spells, etc., were useful, and you were like, no, it's germs and you need to wash your hands. And people were like, get out of here, this crazy donut over here.
Look, I had the opportune thing, the opportunity of getting COVID as well in March, and I think again, just being skeptical and being open-minded about things, because people say, oh, you should drink this vitamin, that vitamin, do this and do that, and that's sort of like. And then I did my own research, and actually, taking some vitamins at that particular time may not be helpful. All you need to do is sort of like rest and drink lots of liquid and yada, yada, yada. And so I think it's just that, basically, rather than absorbing everything without questioning, and then just have some healthy skepticism about everything. And then, like, not all marketing speakers are good, and not all marketing speakers are bad as well. And then not every academics from marketing field are sort of like dogmatic and really this scary figures. And I maybe just have to come and hear with an open mind, because actually both sides can learn a lot from each other. Like businesses can learn a lot from the researchers and vice versa, because there are some things that can't be explained through quantitative data. And there are also a lot of things that business can learn based on what we have found out through research from other fields. And
such a good point. That's such a good point. There's one of the things that I tell my students is you can view it as kind of a spectrum. And then on the one hand, you have these mouth breathers that I mentioned earlier. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have the I call it entrepreneurial science, but that includes some other fields as well, but marketing scientists. But ironically, it's not the marketing scientists themselves, but like people who are maybe view themselves as experts as well, but they don't have like necessarily the rigorous training, who tend to think that there's this, they inject this attitude on the marketing scientists, where it's like, peer-reviewed paper or else. If there's no peer-reviewed paper, no literature in some prestigious journal, then it's nonsense. And one of the things that I tell my students is there is actually a middle ground. So the example that I always give is the UFC. So before the UFC, we had all of these martial arts. You had Kung Fu, Jeet Kune Do, karate, judo, BJJ, Muay Thai, all of that stuff. And everyone was like, yo, our thing is superior. And then you have the peace and love people who are like, no, everyone's martial arts. There is no right one. It's all about the practitioner, which, there is going to be one thing which stands out, most likely. So a few people said, okay, let's just do science. They didn't say that, but that's essentially what happened. And they said, okay, we're going to make an octagon. We're going to throw a bunch of fighters with different styles in there, and we'll just see. And the reason why I give that anecdote is to explain to my students that science doesn't necessarily mean a blackboard, or it doesn't necessarily mean a peer-reviewed paper. It's simply, to paraphrase Richard Feynman, a methodology to separate that which is false from that which is more likely to be true. Or let me say say less likely to be false. That's perhaps more accurate. It's just a methodology. So they were essentially doing science because they were controlling multiple variables in a reasonably good way. And then if you're, a good scientist, then sure, you can raise objections such that, maybe you have an external validation issue where you might argue that the octagon doesn't translate perfectly to a street situation or what have you. But, science is not, that's kind of like a utopia argument. It's not about perfection. It's progress, not perfection. And we did actually learn a lot from that. So one of the things that people noticed was that BJJ was superior in itself than every other martial art. And then later on, they saw that if you know a little bit of BJJ and a little bit of kickbox or Muay Thai, that's superior than just knowing BJJ. So it's better to spend 5 years on both versus 10 years on just BJJ. So you saw the combination, etc.
Exactly.
So then you got an evolution in which martial arts were actually useful and which weren't. And that's essentially, you can imagine that, it would be silly to argue, I can't find the Journal of Mixed Martial Arts, some fancy terminology, with peer-reviewed studies on which punches are the most effective, etc. No, it would be foolish to throw away all of that knowledge aside. So when I have this conversation with my mentor, Rory Sutherland, one of the things that he always says is he talks about tacit knowledge or implicit knowledge, and I think that's spot on. The tacit knowledge that salespeople have or business people have, and sometimes by these these so-called experts, it gets tossed aside too quickly. Where it's evidence-based science means only peer-reviewed study in a certain journal, and everything that's not in a journal is nonsense. And that's too aggressive, in my opinion.
Look, I totally agree. It's some of the things, some of the thoughts, some of the approaches that I think to myself, this would be interesting to test, comes when I'm talking to people, when I'm baking things at home, and I thought what if I do this, just being creative with my approach, and then. Again, as I mentioned, just being open-minded and then just looking, through talking to people from different fields, listening to talks from different subjects, and actually just sort of absorbing those wisdom, but not sort of just wholesale, but also testing oh, nah, that seems to be too far out, for example. But I think. In terms of, look, I would say there are a lot of wisdom from journal papers, of course, but they're really, really bad journal papers. I mean, even if when they're already peer reviewed, some of the papers that we've read, and then it's just it's really, really bad. It's just a lot of, let's just say, a lot of academic chest beating, right? So
and also you have to be incredibly careful when you have to be incredibly careful with your own confirmation bias, where you have already determined that you want to win an argument or you want to be right, and then you're selectively searching for the papers that agree with you.
That's right. And I think that's why I think within the institute we are careful as well, basically, sort of it. And I find myself even sort of having to catch myself before saying things, if I'm not really sure that we have done or there is enough evidence for me to say it. Right, because for example, now the institute is doing more research in B2B, for example, whilst some of the laws are applied in B2B, some of the things that we haven't really tested. So we may have some hypotheses, but at the moment, that area is ongoing. My own area of research is portfolio management, and then of the things that I've done, of the things that I have studied, I have a stronger confidence for me to say, yep, A is more likely to be correct. But of the things that we haven't tested, I think as scientists we are much more careful in saying based on what we know, that is more likely to be correct, but rather than giving a definitive answer. And I think this is why I'm getting more and more sort of careful with consultants or speakers, and like if they give such definitive statements, I said like,
but that's
what proof do you have?
Yeah, that's the problem, because if you look at newspaper and newspaper headlines, or just ads, by the way,
yes,
those are a result of evolution, exactly the same as human evolution. You know, you have a certain selective pressure in the environment, and you know, certain organisms can reproduce, etc. And over time, you know, you get an organism which is adapted to the environment. And if you look at the current ads and the current headlines, it's very clear to see that that being a good scientist is not what attracts eyeballs. So you know, saying, well, in this very specific circumstance, we can say with a reasonable degree of certainty that this is most likely to be correct. However, in a different situation, no one is going to read that. So you have to say you have to make it sexy, and then you get these headlines where they completely take the external validation, you know, overboard, and it's like, scientists have definitively found out that X is always the case. And yeah, Professor Bruce, I'm gonna talk about questions from my audience in a second, but Professor Bruce actually made a remark, actually, that he talked about the oversimplified version of the EBI thinking. You know, targeting is overrated, targeting is nonsense. So you have these, you know, you have these some of these findings from you guys, or from academia in general, and they get so simplified to the point of, you know, that the original authors wouldn't even agree with it anymore.
exactly. And this is the thing as well. Sometimes but
you kind of have to almost.
I know, but I think we are in the age of like clickbaiting, and like you said, right, just like kept capturing people's attention. But I think it's oversimplified, so that, you know, it comes to the point where we as the authors, or we as the researchers, are like, nah, we didn't say that. You know, so say, for example, like one of the criticisms of the Institute research is like, we don't believe in loyalty. We don't believe in consumer loyalty, which is incorrect. We're just saying that there is a pattern in consumer loyalty that it's related to
double jeopardy.
brand size. Exactly. And then but I think when people kind of take a snippet and then just basically, they didn't understand the whole thing, but they thought that little snippet is the truth of the whole thing, and that's just dangerous.
Yeah, one of the things that I'm hoping to accomplish is before we had back in the 80s until like maybe 2000 or something, maybe a little bit later even, you had bodybuilding full stop. So, you know, people were lifting weights and, you know, trying to build muscle and lose fat. And there was a lot of what they call in that particular space, bro science. And by the way, quick tangent, it's actually surprising how decent much of the bro science has turned out to be when scientists started using those as hypotheses for experiments. And you know, it's not 100% perfect, but oftentimes it's very close. So one of the things that that came from bro science was the amount of protein that you should take for optimal muscle growth, and they said a gram per pound, and it turned out to be slightly less, something like 0.7, 0.8 or whatever. But you know, that's and then you could argue that maybe they thrown in a little bit of psychology there, because 0.7, 0.8, whatever is more difficult, that mental connection than 1. So you know, very, very interesting. But the reason why I bring this up is because there are now a few YouTubers and content creators who have been able to create an audience of, you know, somewhere in the range of like 1 to 2 million people. So there is an appetite for that evidence-based. They call it evidence-based bodybuilding. Yeah, and there are people who are interested in that. So I'm hoping that, you know, probably if you're going to use this approach, you're never going to be like super huge, but I'm hoping that there are people who are like, okay, I'm getting confused because one person says X and the other person says the inverse of X. So it's not even like, you know, tangential to X. It's the complete opposite, and they both sound super confident, and you know, they both have credentials, and I'm so confused. I don't know who to trust, and that's super frustrating. So I'm hoping that you know, I can create something where the people who are interested in more evidence-based stuff don't have to go through that process, which Go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, and again, it comes back to the principle of just test it and then see which one actually worked. Look, I'll show you. I guess I can tell you an anecdote.
Yeah, that's
prior
perfect.
to joining,
exactly. That was just what I was about to ask you. How do you guys do that at EBI?
I mean, prior to joining the institute, I was working in the industry, as I mentioned earlier, and then like we have been. I worked in one of the financial institution, and then we always track customer satisfaction, for example, and customer defection.
NPS or something?
Pardon me? No. At that time, NPS was starting, but we didn't track NPS. But it's just basically just 1 to 5 scale of customer satisfaction, and then we look at the degree of defection
Likert
as well.
skill stuff.
Yeah, that's right. And basically, we track it every month, and our customer at that time, the company's customers were highly satisfied, and yet the defection was high. And on top of that, there were, we focus on the company focused on segmentation as well, looking at this segment and making them happy, yada yada yada. And yet defection continued to be high. And then so I remember presenting it to the executives, and then the executives kind of look at me and they say, like, look, our customers are happy, yeah? He said, yes, very, very happy, like really, really high average and really high top 2 box, yeah, and etc. And then they sort of like, but how come the defection continues to be high? And then we focus on the segments, and then what happened if they change? In the next round, like, do we need to change our segments? And all those questions, like, without knowing the principles, without knowing any base, I think it could be confusing. And at that time I was confused, because basically I thought segmentation was a way to go to growth, but then clearly it's not really working. And so I think marketers as a whole would need to basically have the courage to let go of some of the old concepts. Like, a lot of us have grown up with Kotler books and a lot of basically concepts that are perhaps not very productive. And then we need to be brave to let go and then try to look at sort of like principles that are based on evidence that can basically help the company to grow. And of course, it's and again, as I said, be very careful in terms of looking into this alternative theories and alternative practices as well, because like you wouldn't want to switch from one guru to the next guru. You would want to switch to something that perhaps more evidence-based, and then something that's empirically sound. So I think that would be, I think, one of my key tip. And I think I certainly have, I'm a bit ashamed when I look when I remember the things that I prescribed the old company to do, and like all the things that I did. And then now that I know, actually, yes, there's a reason why defection is high. If the brand is one of the smaller brands compared to the bigger brands, because you would, our customer, that the customers would actually flock to the bigger brands. So, without having that really elegant explanation, because we know the principles, then the wrong thing is actually doing more modeling. Like, who who were the defectors? What kind of demographic, or maybe they're, we should focus more on the single female over the age, blah.
Again,
you know what I mean, right?
Yeah, again, such a terrific point, such a truly good point, because it's and I catch myself doing this as well. It's so incredibly hard. That's maybe why it's even instead of trying to change yourself, instead what you should do is have people who are the inverse of you. So there's this friend of mine. Yeah, his name is David Smith. A truly 10 out of 10 dude, and he comes from quantum mechanics, actually, so physics, and then transferred into marketing because he realized that all the cool kids are here. Obviously, you know, look at us. That's why we're doing this. Let's be honest. People, you're too cool for investment banking. Go to marketing. Where you belong.
There you go.
But he's the opposite of me in many ways. So, and that's actually better because that's a better way of finding the median versus both trying to, you know, approach that median, because then you have vigorous discussions. And if you look at science at the ensemble scale, you see that exact same phenomenon, because you have one author who says X and you have another author who says X inverse, and then the entire scientific community starts discussing in order to find out which one is actually correct, and people try to disprove each other to gain academic street cred, which Professor Bruce Clark has a lot of, because he's awesome. But then, you know, that's kind of how the process works. So very similar to MMA in that regard.
But I think this is a thing about, you know, I think a lot of things, a lot of marketers, and I think with this creeping sort of like belief or technique from computer science and machine learning, artificial intelligence, sometimes we just forgot about Occam's razor. Like, the simplest explanation is that perhaps this is the best thing. You know, it's
you forget
simple solution is almost every time the best. The best. And I think that's why I mentioned about this defecting customers or defecting buyers as well. Like in the past, I would then go on another round of research looking at the commonalities of people who defect, rather than accepting, like, actually there's a principle that governs that, like with double jeopardy.
Yeah, what we're essentially talking about is first principles, because what you're doing in one situation is instead of saying this is a conjecture, what you're saying is this is an axiom, and because it's an axiom, you have already assumed it's true, so you keep continuing to research it in order to try and validate it. So maybe if we can segment differently, or maybe we're missing some data, which like you implicitly said, it could be true. However, the simplest possibility is usually the correct one. So if there's a simpler possibility on the table, it's worth exploring that first. And one of the things that people tend to do is, because they have this axiomatic reasoning where they start with this is correct, any data which rejects that claim needs to be re-examined. And then, you know, if you still aren't able to validate that claim, then you need to come up with like some complicated thesis as to why what you were saying is actually true. And then you get lost in this rabbit hole where it's not where it's no longer about finding out what's true or what's false. It's about finding ways in which you can prove that your axiom is actually correct. But so it's a conclusion first way of doing things.
Yes, and again, it's, as I mentioned, sometimes the focus is on the process. Sometimes the focus in wowing the audience of what you have done, or the complex modeling, or the complex thing, or the complex analysis. But towards the end, what you found through those convoluted process may not actually answer the initial challenge. Perhaps there's an alternative explanation to the phenomenon that was trying to be answered, or simply through knowing the principles that govern them.
Yeah, I fully agree. All right, there's one question that I have, or maybe two questions, and then let me ask you a few questions from the people who send in some questions. Sure. So the thing that I'm wondering about is, help us understand what your day looks like, in the sense that there's some conjecture that you have. I wake up and I get a cup of coffee, and in the sense of you have a conjecture. How do you go about figuring out whether or not that conjecture is true? So do you start with like collecting data, or do you hire agencies to do that for you, and then you analyze the data, or what's the process like? Help me understand that.
So if I would say, look, I think knowing the basis knowledge is crucial, right? So, for example, if there is a new challenge, there's a new research challenge, and I would say it's being a researcher, being a scientist is just doing a lot of thinking, and then just basically a lot of mulling things over, and then being open to, again, as I said, being open to a lot of different concepts from natural science, etc. And then sometimes it's from those thinking that's like, oh, maybe I should read this paper or that paper, and then doing my own desk research, and then just talking to other people, other scientists within the institute and outside of the institute, and from then on, then when perhaps it's sort of like, oh, now we've got a real research question that we that we need to answer, and then we look at the data. If we have the data that can be used to answer that, or sort of like do primary data collection perhaps, and then just basically test that.
All right, so step number one, research question. Step number two, data. Step number three, experiment. How do you do the data collection?
So the data is a lot of we at the Institute are quite fortunate in a way that we have access to some of the panel data for the academic research. But so some of the answers can be explained through this panel data, or retail scanner data. But if they can't be answered through those data pools, then basically thinking of designing a questionnaire or designing a survey to basically looking at how we can get the responses from the panel, right? So but of course, I think even with data collection as well, that's why I think as scientists, as academic scientists, this is where our academic thinking comes in as well, that we need to be careful when we collect data, so that we don't just get the stated behavior that basically masks the actual behavior. And so that's why a lot of the research that we do at the Institute is based on the actual behavior, actual purchase behavior, and how it changes over time. Because if we talk to the respondents online and talking about something that that they may give the model answer, or that they give answers that they think we want to hear, that will lead the survey astray. So that's why.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I had a conversation with a woman who was a PhD in psychology, and she tweeted something that she wrote and a research paper about some finding about women versus men. And I don't want to get like too political or whatever, but at least from my perspective, there seems to be slightly a little bit of a war on men going on. So this was this finding, which it struck me as women are awesome, men suck, essentially. And I asked her a question, like, I read the research paper and I read your summary of it. Did you guys control for social desirability? So it's saying what people expect. Yes. You're feeling, so what you're hoping for is that people will answer it honestly, but that's actually quite a sophisticated process, because you're asking two things. First, you're asking for people to use their system to thinking to observe system one behavior. So you're asking them to think about how do you react in that moment, and their answer may or may not be true. If you ask someone, what would you do when your house is being robbed or something, the likelihood of that person actually giving the correct answer, you're relying on hope, essentially, because it need not necessarily be the case that they're like, I would definitely, I would do XYZ, defend everyone, and maybe they freeze up. You just don't know. So that's already one issue. And then the second issue is the social desirability, where it's like, I don't want to feel bad about myself, so I'm going to give the answer that I think people want to hear. So those are two major confounders, which you need to stress. And, to her credit, she admitted it, and she was like, nah, we didn't really do that. And that made me worried that it was more of a an opinion piece with some science sprinkled on top of it, to kind of like bamboozle the audience. Need not necessarily be the case, but it's something to be conscious of.
Totally. So that's why I think the Ehrenberg-Bass Institute, I think that's why I mentioned that we actually like working with the actual behavior data rather than stated data, or because of those reasons.
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah.
Great point. All right. Let me ask some questions from
Sure.
How are you doing on time? You're good?
Yeah, I'm good.
Wonderful. All right. Okay, so I got a question from Harris. B2B marketers heavily claim that the top 20% accounts make 80% of their revenue. The opposite of the opposite pattern to the EBI findings on FMCG. So he's talking about the heavy buyers essentially. Does EBI have any recent data on revenue distributions in B2B categories specifically? And if so, does this data suggest that this finding is true or false?
Look, I would say this is one area that we're still pursuing, that we're still, research is ongoing. So rather than me sort of like giving an answer that's essentially untrue, we have seen some of the principles of focusing on reach and penetration also applies for B2B, rather than focusing on a small segment. Like if the company wants to grow, more people would need to know about the company, right? So I think this is also apparent from when I watch TV here in Australia. I start seeing ads for essentially B2B services, like say accounting services, and then they play it in high rating show here in Australia, and again it's great in a way. So get more people to know about the business. And of course, I think when you ask about whether the 20/80 or heavy half or light half also apply in B2B, and I think this is research in this area is ongoing, but we have seen some of the principles that govern sort of like consumer behavior, CPG, and consumer behavior also extend to B2B. But in terms of this, I would say, watch this space, I would say.
Yeah, I actually had a question again to see whether or not you would agree or disagree, but you've already implicitly answered it, because one of the things that I believe is that marketing has a similar phenomenon to mathematics, which is domain constraints. So certain things in mathematics can be true or false depending on the domain. So 2 is divisible by 5. That's false for integers and natural numbers, but it's true for rational and reals. Or the angles of a triangle add up to 180 degrees, depends on whether or not you're talking about non-Euclidean space or Euclidean space. And in marketing, I believe that there's a similar phenomenon when you're talking about the size of a company, but also different domains, like you mentioned, B2B and B2C. So you already implicitly answered that question. Again, I think this is something that people do wrong when the supposed experts who are more concerned with seeming smart, they misunderstand the research that you guys are doing, and they make this external validity case. It becomes more of a religion almost. EBI said X, therefore it's true always, and it's like no. EBI is science. They're not gurus or looking for followers, etc. So yeah. And you guys don't even say that. If you read the book, nowhere does it says that this is a universal pattern that applies until the end of time, independent of all variables, and this has to be taken as gospel.
Exactly. And
disagreement dooms you to a life in purgatory. Yes.
I mean, we have started with the abundance of data, right? With the abundance of sort of like processing power as well. And this is exciting in a way, because like during the times of Andrew Ehrenberg and Frank Bass, and I think computer was not as powerful as it is now, and the available data is not as abundant as it is now. So there are things that at the moment that we can actually test and expand the boundaries of what Andrew Ehrenberg found, and then through the research that we do at the Institute, because basically, that now that we have more data, we can look at even further time period, whether that would still hold or not. And so, as I mentioned, a lot of the things that we do with marketing science actually borrow or apply a lot from natural science.
Yeah.
And in a lot of the things, I think rather than just focusing on hearsay or testing statements or belief, we are almost like operating like medical scientists. Like, let's prod and test this, whether it works or not.
Yeah, there's one newsletter that I'm subscribed to, and it's by a medical practitioner, and he talks about this new trend of evidence-based medicine, which is quite young. I'm not comfortable saying exactly how many years, but it's in the order of decades, maybe something like 3 or 4 or something, quite young still. And from my perspective, when it comes to doing research and disseminating the information, it feels like they're slightly ahead of marketing. And they talk about the exact same things that you have been talking about, like this marriage between clinical practice and the stuff that you find in research, and there needs to be a bi-directional flow of information there, because sometimes information from in a well-controlled situation is incredibly useful to practitioners. Sometimes information flows the other way. An obvious example would be ideas for research questions, of course, which can come from clinical practices. So yeah. Oh, by the way, I apologize. I see my video is lagging. Hopefully it's it's catching up. All right, cool.
It's all good.
All right, wonderful.
No, and then I think following your point as well, that's why I think I really enjoy talking to different people and talking to different people from the industry as well, so that just to ensure that what we research and what we focus on, myself as one of the researchers at the Institute, our research is just to make sure that our research is still relevant to the businesses out there, so we don't end up navel gazing into something that is really not important in the big scheme of things. That we research things that actually matter a lot to business and to marketing.
Yeah, great point. All right, I got a question from Professor Bruce Clark. B2B folks can be skeptical of the targeting is overrated summary that is an oversimplified version of EBI thinking. They will argue that targeting leads to more profitable customers. Most of the EBI research that I have seen emphasizes sales and share. Is there evidence on profit?
That's a great question. I think with profit, I think it comes with the trust from the company as well, right? And then I think because the extension of the principles into B2B is in infancy at the moment, relative infancy compared to what we know about consumer behavior, I would say again, I would say watch the space. As more people, I guess, as companies would share about the profitability or the margin as well as their revenue, then we would know more about this. But I think, we focus a lot on revenue. That's because it is readily available or more readily available, right? Yeah. But when we're talking about profits and margins, usually it's something that's more guarded more closely. Yeah. And so it would be really interesting to look at sort of like really whether in terms of profitability it stacks up as well. And again, as I said, it's good to test this, and I think with availability of data and hopefully with trust from businesses, we can look into this as well.
Do you guys have any insights on positioning? Because like I said, I work a lot with bootstrappers. And when it comes to, the very earliest stage, it seems that at least the implicit knowledge seems to imply that positioning is incredibly important in order to help the consumer understand, or the customer in general, why you are different from someone else. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah,
unsure yet. Unsure.
Yeah, I think with positioning, at the like I think if I position myself as consumer behavior, as consumers, I think there was one phrase that Andrew Ehrenberg likes to use, that we satisfice as customers, that you're with the belief that yes, it'll do kind of thing, rather than worry too much about positioning. And I think this is
I have
what's
noticed. I have noticed that as well. I agree. I've noticed that as well, because if I look at my my own product that I sell, which is I sell two products essentially, outside of like consulting for firms, etc., which is a 12-week boot camp to help people get started, which is very it's very similar to MMA in the sense that it's not like an online course where here's the information and good luck, but it's like very similar to an MMA school where you have a time that you show up with other students and you implement the information, which makes it vastly easier from a behavior science perspective. And the other one is a more general upskilling thing, which is 6 months, where we talk about basically entrepreneurial science in the tangent fields. So like consumer behavior, but also game theory and introduction to statistics, much more wider marketing science, what we know, etc. During the explanation of the products, I completely forgot why I went on this tangent. Oh, I remember. I remember satisficing. So when I'm selling to people, when I'm doing like direct outreach or what have you, I notice the same thing. The consumers or the customers who are joining, they aren't necessarily saying, okay, hang on, let me spend 17 months in order to accurately determine whether value-wise this is the very best solution that I can possibly get, etc. It's like I trust this guy. I've seen his information. I've read his material. He's hitting me up. Yeah, sure. Why not? And that's very similar to how we act in a day-to-day basis. You want a cup of coffee, you see a few coffee places nearby. You're not going to take out your phone and spend 3.5 hours figuring out, is this the exact best place? Because
that's right.
I exactly.
And this is also the thing, I think, what's getting to marketing these days, right? And I think at the end of the day, it's like, I think customers, we are simple-minded. We're cognitive misers. We basically like, look, just make things easy for us, please. If I want to buy toothpaste, I don't care about your positioning, this and that. If I want to buy fragrances, or if I want to buy this and that, if it does the job and it's within my means of paying for the product. And if I can think of the brand and I can access the brand easily, that's it. I mean, because I think this is why I think as marketers we make things really, really hard for our customers. With all this purpose-driven marketing, with all this sort of like beliefs, with all this sort of like complex positioning, like, no, this brand is not for you if you're overweight, or no, this brand is not for you if you're old, if you're young. And then like all this segmentation, all this positioning, it's just, at the end of the day, it hinders, I think, the growth of the brand. And I think whilst people may mistakenly sort of like take the message of making sure that brands are physically available and mentally available as something that is too simplistic, I think the approach should be how to apply those principles to grow the brands, rather than adding things that complicate the concepts, and then basically at the end lost the plot, and making it harder for customers to buy. I hope that makes sense.
No, yeah, I fully agree. There is one conjecture that I have, which feel free to disagree. But I suspect that, at least that's what I'm teaching my students currently. It seems like that positioning in the very early days matters more, simply because of your lack of marketing budget. So if you right out of the gate, if you're like, we do X, and we do not even X, we do everything for everyone, then you don't have the marketing budget to talk to all of those people. Whereas if you're like, if you constrain it by saying, we focus on X and we specifically help you solve Y, that makes your marketing efforts much more easier, because you can kind of become a big fish in almost like an aquarium. The analogy that I give is like, instead of like going on your shitty little rowboat and your fishing rod in the vast ocean, and with the mistaking justification of there are trillions of fish in the ocean. Yeah, that's true, but the ocean is also super vast. Instead of what you're doing is you're taking that same little crappy fishing rod, but you're sneaking into your local pet shop, and you start fishing in their aquarium. So at least in the beginning, it seems much easier if you have positioning, and then as the company scales at some point, you can take it more broadly. But yeah, like I said, feel free to disagree. Maybe you're like
no, I think
100% nonsense.
I wouldn't say that, but I think, look, I would politely disagree with that. I think
how dare you, doctor.
Okay, I'll go offline then. No, it's I think it's answering to consumers' needs, right? So say, for example, one of the things that I used to mention to my students is that if I have a dog walking business in sort of like, say, I live in Adelaide, so if I have a dog walking business in the western part of Adelaide, I'll just make sure that I do the job well, but I don't need to worry too much about positioning. Oh, everything that we do, it's sort of like fully organic, or the dogs will listen to Beethoven and Bach as they walk around the neighborhood. No, I wouldn't worry about that. Basically, make sure that the dogs are well cared for, and then they walk throughout. And then if people are happy that I fulfill the category needs, and maybe they would refer more, and then maybe I can then expand my sort of like mail drops or my campaign into a bigger area. And as my business grows, then maybe I can recruit more people to join me in my dog walking business. And I think, following on your analogy on fishing as well, so because I wrote in my blog, like a lot of small companies or a lot of small brands kind of like have this maybe it's sort of like a misplaced belief, like, oh, look, I want to be a fisherman, but I will only fish for for a certain type of fish. Like, for example, I'm going to look, I'm not a fisherman. I don't do fishing, so that's why I don't know the name of a lot of fish. But say, for example,
maybe for example, some certain kind of tuna or whatever.
Yeah. For example, cods or tunas, right? So, for example, like, oh no, I don't care about tuna. I only want to catch cod, and like, so I would, if I drop my net in the ocean, in the sea, and then if I catch not the fish that I want, I will let them go. Like, that's really silly. Like, if I want to be a successful businessman, I would throw my net as big as possible through the net that I can afford at that time, and then grab as much fish as I want, as long as they're fish, and then sell them. And then as the business grows, then get bigger fish, bigger net and bigger boat as well. But I think perhaps smaller companies, and this is I think a better way to channel the resources, or channel the budget as well, rather than worrying too much about positioning. So this is where I think I would disagree with the positioning. Perhaps could be important, but I would say focusing too much on positioning, focusing too much on making things too complex for the business, I think it's not productive. I'll put it that way.
Yeah. Can I politely counter you one time, just to just to see what you're thinking? One of the things that I'm wondering about, to hear your thoughts, selfishly, because it's very interesting for me. I just dislocated my knee in a sport that I do. I do kind of extreme sports, and I fully dislocated my knee. But when I went to fix it, I didn't go to see a generalist. In fact, they referred me to a generalist. But my job is to essentially read literature and research papers. So I did my homework, and I knew quite a bit. And in fact, by certain questions, I could see that the person that I was talking to wasn't as up to date as I was, because I essentially had like an unfair advantage in the sense that I just spent multiple days going through all of the latest available research, etc. Where this person has a full-time job doing fixing knees and whatever. But it was a hospital for like the average consumer, so for normal people essentially. And that guy was an orthopedic surgeon who did multiple joints essentially. But eventually, what I did is I said, okay, this guy, he's not up to my standards. So what I did is I went to a special type of private hospital. And I went to a different orthopedic surgeon, where it quickly became very apparent that he actually, is well read on the literature. And in fact, he only does knees. He only specializes in the injury that I had. And I believe they do something around in the neighborhood of 200 to 400 knees per year. So vastly different situation. So because of that positioning, essentially, I went to that guy. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts, because if I say, okay, I only fish for, a specific kind of fish, I can develop a kind of expertise and specialism in that domain versus, being very broad and trying to do everything under the sun. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, and look, I think there is no disagreement with that, because I think it's to me, I see it more like category needs. For example, for this particular, if for example I want to specialize in, as I mean, taking the example, my silly example of dog walking, right? So I'm going to walk dogs. No, I'm not going to walk cats. I'm not walking to walk ferrets. So, but making sure that more people know about my dog walking business, but I don't worry too much about positioning outside of the category needs. Like, for example, I would only walk dogs that are only fed with vegetarian food. They're only sort of like, all this fluffy things, making things too hard for the consumers.
Yeah.
So like taking your orthopedic example as well. So at least you would hear about this particular person. So I think mentally that particular doctor's mental availability is quite wide in the market, because you hear about this particular doctor with this specific expertise as well. So it's great in a way, because then the more people know about his expertise, the more people would come to him, right? But so to me, I think the expertise on something to me it's not, does not equate positioning, but to me it's almost like focusing on the category needs. So for example, a milk producer would focus on milk, but they wouldn't worry too much about orange juice, because that's not in their area of expertise. So it's to me, I see it that way. So it's not a question of positioning, but it's a question of, hey, this is a product category that we're going to offer the consumers.
Got it. Super interesting. All right. Do you have time for 2 or 3 more questions, or do you have to run?
No, maybe 2 or 3 more questions is good.
Perfect. Then we'll do that, and then we'll wrap it up. Let me go to the mama bear of the evidence-based marketing community, Kirti, the lovely human being that is Kirti. Dr. Arry's blog posts are a sheer delight to read.
Thank you.
Question. In what way, if at all, does banking differ from other categories when interpreting the laws of growth? Are there any peculiarities to bear in mind when marketing of financial services?
That is a great question as well, because I think in the past, having worked in banking and finance, there's too much focus on sort of like cross-selling. There's too much focus on focusing on a narrower segment and making sure that they're loyal, right? So this is in a way, I think the more banks know about the principles or how brands grow, I think the better. Because I remember questions from the executives, and like, if they're so happy with us, why do they keep on banking with other banks?
Mm.
And so I think this was the focus on too much on navel gazing, on the cross-selling, on the modeling what kind of consumers that we need to target, but not so much and sort of like wide advertising. And so, because at the end of the day, it's especially now with the advancement of technology and data, right? So getting a new credit card or getting a loan or opening an account is not as cumbersome as it was 30 years ago, where you have to come to a branch and then just establish an account, yada, yada, yada. Now you can do it through online. So in effect, it has become commoditized. So it's almost like very similar to getting, buying, a consumer packaged goods or getting a service. So that's why I think, the more people would know about that, hey, if you're looking for a home loan, if you're looking for a credit card, if you're looking for a time deposit, come to us, because we can give you that service, that product really well, really pain-free. I think the better. But if the company kind of focus on superficial things that make things harder for the consumers, I would say that's not very productive. And that was actually my experience. And admittedly, the last time I worked in banking was around 20 years ago, shows my age. But I think to a certain degree, even now, banks or financial companies are still focusing too much on sort of like this cross-selling or navel gazing, rather than ensuring that more people know about the services and the products.
Interesting. This is a question which I'm very curious about to hear your answer as well. From John Bradshaw, does mental market share lead penetration growth or lag it?
Oh, that is one of those things. Like, look, if
easy question, softball.
I know. Golly. Look, I would say the way that we would talk, because of course, look, as a researcher, like apparently, and again, before I joined the academia, there's some, the earlier discussion is like, look, do you research consumer behavior or do you research advertising, right? So, because apparently there are two groups of researchers, and so within this as well, like within the principles at the institute, like perhaps there are people who research more into mental availability. There are more researchers into physical availability. Because of my focus in portfolio and because of my focus in physical availability, I would say, physical availability would be important. However, I would explain my position on this. So physical availability is more like do or die, right? So like, because at the moment of purchase, at the moment of need, is the brand there or not? But it doesn't build a lot of memory. So it only at the point of purchase. So for example, if I go to the supermarket and there are some brands that do not advertise at all, I would be exposed only at that particular shopping trip. And maybe, yes, if I seem to notice it, then it would have a residual sort of like memory in my mind.
Yeah.
And I would say, oh yeah, now there's that brand. But the reach would be really, really low. And so I think there's still much to dig as well in terms of mental availability and physical availability. But I would say the mental availability lingers. And so, even years and years and years after the Old Spice's ad came in the US, people still talk about it. People still use it as an example because it lingers. It stays even beyond the 28 days. With physical availability, though, the importance of it is that it needs to be there at the moment of purchase. Because if it's not there, then you probably think of the alternatives. Like if I'm looking for a pair of pants, if I go to Gap or if I go to department store website and they don't have my size or they're not within my price range, I would go elsewhere. But for me to know where to go with my Google or with to know that I should go to www.gap.com, that is based on my memory, right? Because that's that brand needs to be registered in my mind first, and so they need to work together. And then the lagging or the leading, it's not as simplistic as it is, because they basically work together. I mean, there are some brands that they would advertise in the market before the brands are distributed. That could work. There are brands that basically distributed first and then they would advertise. That could work as well. But I think the important thing is doing it with reach and penetration in mind.
Rory Sutherland actually talks about the first example that you gave, where he talked about establishing credibility in some sense, because it can have this subconscious signal that you're sending, which is if this brand is willing to invest all of this money in advertising, they're probably not going to take my money and run. So it might boost your perceived credibility subconsciously, which I think is very, very interesting. All right, cool. Last question. Ian Bernard, how would he grow a startup or a small brand to a medium-sized business? What core teaching or frameworks would he use? Probably Ian is slightly self-interested here. I am as well, so curious. Let's go superhero.
Yeah. I would say it's that. I mean, like, as hopefully, it's not. Hopefully, I don't sound like a broken record, but it's basically focusing on that, focusing on mental availability and physical availability. For example, right? If I have a limited budget to advertise my business, then I need to make sure that the money that I put would reach as many people as that money could. For example, if I put it on Instagram or LinkedIn or sort of like Facebook, I need to make sure that the things that I set, the parameters that I set, would get as many people as possible, rather than being sidelined through all this segmentation and then sort of like really unnecessary filtering. If, for example, I don't, taking the example of my silly example of dog minding business, perhaps I can sort of like, as well as putting it on Facebook and in my postcode, I would also make sure that I do mail drops around the neighborhood that I service. Still, again, making sure that mental availability is established in where I can service, and then ensuring that I am easy to approach as well in terms of physical availability, that I can be contacted to phone, I can be contacted to text message, to email, and I think this is how I would say it applies from an SME to sort of like to grow as well. Set some budget to ensure that you grow your mental availability, and then ensuring that that budget is also grown to reach as many of the potential audience or potential consumers as possible. That would be my tip, because I think the principle is very, very similar. So, for example, this is the example that I always gave to my students when I taught this as well. Like, if I'm doing my dog minding business in the west of Adelaide, I will not advertise in the national TV, because there are a lot of areas that I don't service, but I will make sure that the western side of Adelaide is well covered by my advertising, either through mail drops, either through Facebook, And I wouldn't worry too much about, say, only people who have 2 kids and 3 cars and 2 dogs. No, I will have to make, focusing on reach, focusing on penetration, and then anything, anything that would basically grow that mental availability, and ensuring that I can actually service that through, ensuring the physical availability is also taken care of.
The thing that I'm wondering about is if it's not easier if you focus on a specific type of person versus like casting this wide net. So if I think about something like say opening a barber shop, but you specialize only in like 12 haircuts and you only do it for men. So maybe it's like, because I have one of those here actually. It's an old school men's barber shop, and they only do the razor fades and like executive contours and kind of like the hairstyles that you saw in the Mad Men show.
Yes.
So I used to go there before I before COVID happened, and I went with the military buzz. But one of the things that I'm wondering about is it might make it easier, and feel free to disagree again, to optimize the business for that specific thing, because you know what you're going to get, so you can create efficiency there. Yeah, and it might make it easier to make your customer happy, because you have a very clear understanding of who is going to walk through your door. Yeah. Versus if you're a general barbershop, which we also have a lot of, where they pretty much they don't know. Everyone can come through the door. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts there. So if you have that dog walking business, but you specialize only in like a certain kind of breed, doesn't that make it easier to make the product truly outstanding, because you have such a good understanding of for who you're doing it for, versus if pretty much. Yeah, you see where this is going.
And I think again, I'm in agreement with you, because I think what we're talking about, the functional differences, right? Category. So it's talking about this specific category that I'm only doing, barbering only if you want, say, the retro look, or if I'm only barbering with a certain sort of like, if you're really crazy about your shade, etc. And then I'm only doing my dog walking business if it's sort of like small to medium size.
I understand what you're saying. Yeah,
but it's not. There are no other
fake
sort of like
fake things.
Exactly, additional filtering that's unnecessary. Like if there's
your favorite color is blue, then
exactly
you're not, exactly.
No, sorry, I'm not going to walk your dog because your income is below like 100,000 euros per year, and it's just like, look, if they can pay for the service that I provide, and then it's something that I can do, I'll do it, kind of thing. Like the same with the barbering thing as well. Like if the barbershop then focuses on only like Abercrombie and Fitch, right? Because it's big in Netflix now. If only a certain
I told my students to watch it, actually, white hot. I told them, especially the first half is such a good case study on repositioning a brand, and or whatever you want to call it.
Exactly. And then this is the thing, I mean, I have no issue with the barbershop only focusing on certain technique, because again, that's just category needs. And then but putting too many conditions, and I think that's counterproductive. But I think even in the area of that barbershop as well, if that category need is very small, then maybe at the end of the day, they're also limiting the potential for growth, right? Yeah. Because like if somebody says, look, if somebody comes to their barbershop and says, look, I need a haircut, I have a job interview in 30 minutes, can you do it really quickly with your scissors? And the barbershop kind of says, no, we only do it with a blade, and then we want to give you the best kind of retro look. Look, it's just limiting the potential for growth.
Yeah. Oh wow, super interesting. Now I think I fully understand where you're coming from. I think we're actually on the same page, just a slight difference in terminology, because what you're talking about in terms of category and category needs, you could also talk about like quote unquote real positioning versus like fake positioning, you know? So the difference between you wash cars and you wash pretty much every car, or you only choose to specialize in hand washing cars, which is called detailing, which is a specific way of washing the car to avoid scratches, etc. And then you can imagine that people who naturally take care of their cars want to come to you. So that's something that's a real way of positioning yourself differently, versus you can only come to this particular car wash if your favorite music is hip hop, you know, and if you listen to reggae, you're not welcome. So that's kind of like, you know, it has no business, it has no relation. It's completely artificial.
But this is the thing as well. Like my last remark on this, because like you mentioned about detailing, and then it's great talking to you, RJ, because like you have given me the definition of what detailing is. To me, like again, I'm not really big on. I don't know much about cars, but if I need to have a car, you know, I'm one of the light category buyers in this sense, right? About cars, like for me, cars, yes, they need to look good, but it brings me from point A to point B. And so if I need to get a car wash, I would say, okay, so which service can give me the best car wash as possible? And if they say, oh, look, we're going to give you the full detailing, I'm like, okay, whatever that means, you know, like, okay, as long as I get my car washed.
Got it. All right.
And I would say, lastly, I think, again, as marketers, it's just sometimes I just do an internal head shake when I look at the ads or look at the things that we do as a sector. We make it so hard for consumers to buy our goods, and then we just give them hoops, and we give them sort of like things that they should pass before they buy. It's like, come on, just make things easy.
But by any chance, do you have you seen Jiro Dreams of Sushi? By any chance, that documentary?
I have heard of that, but I haven't watched it.
All right, damn. I was hoping you'd seen it. Yeah.
My homework then, RJ.
Yeah, it's a sushi chef who is obsessed with making the perfect sushi, and his students have to spend something like 10 years perfecting the sushi rice, and then many more months before they graduate to making the simplest sushi, which is just the egg for the egg sushi, the omelet sushi, or not omelet, but like the special type of egg. And he's very particular about like everything, but that also makes it very hard for customers to come eat there, you know. But his focus is like doing because he has a very specific way of how he wants to do it, and it's like, you know, it's my way or the highway. You know, if you want like regular sushi on a sushi belt machine almost factory, then, you know, go eat there. But I get it. Like I would assume that you might not be like the biggest fan of that approach because you're limiting your opportunity. Okay, got it. Yeah.
And look, I think if I would look, and I think at the end of the day, if there is a need for that kind of service, if there's enough category needs, and then you want to stay there, I mean, who am I to say no, you should expand your service offering?
Yeah, we're just talking about if you want to grow.
Yeah, exactly. And then if you want to actually cover more category needs, and then so for example, if there is a hair salon that basically focus on female or making curls, by all means, just making it easy for people who have that category needs to find you. And then that doesn't, you know, and then if you have the capacity, then you can of course cover more category needs, or cover more, get more clientele. But just make things easy for people who have that category needs to come to you.
Dr. Arry Tanusondjaja. Hopefully I said it correctly. No, Tanusondjaja.
Jaya.
Oh, Jaya.
Tanusondjaja. I mean, read it in a Dutch way.
Tanusondjaja. There we go. Tanusondjaja. Dr. Arry Tanusondjaja. All right. Wonderful. I cannot thank you enough. This has been this has been more than an absolute blast. Absolutely amazing. There's so much marketing confusion, so much nonsense, and I enjoyed this so much, and I'm 100% sure that the people who are going to be listening to this will really enjoy this quite a bit. Very grateful for you sharing all of your insights that you have acquired through many years of being in this field. So super grateful. For the people who want to see some more of your work and more of your thoughts, is there anywhere where we can point them to?
Look, I would say the institute website, and then also I have my own blog, but you can find it, and I would say I don't want to be so like self-promoting. You can probably find it, or just follow my Twitter feed.
If you're up for it, I'll definitely have you on in the future, and you're always welcome anytime. You just DM me, and more than welcome to come here.
Yeah, happy to chat.
Wonderful. All right, thank you again, man. This has been awesome.
No, alsjeblieft.
Nice. Dankjewel. Take care.
All right, goodbye.